Hi there, this is Andre Bester and you're joining me on This Is What We Were Told. On this channel I talk about issues of faith and religion that seriously challenged my belief in the integrity of the Bible. In 2020 I published a book on my spiritual journey called This Is What We Were Told. My book is aimed at challenging people to dare to look beyond the limitations of belief and to take in the bigger picture of life. I provide some food for thought for those who might be finding themselves in a spiritual dead end and who are looking for a more meaningful understanding of the world in which we live. On this channel, I give viewers a taste of the topics I cover in my book. On this channel and through my book, I aim to awaken people to the wonders of life, playing out right around them, just beyond the boundaries of faith. So please join me and just maybe you find something useful here. Last time I started talking about who actually wrote Genesis, and Moses' authorship of this book came under suspicion. Today I'd like to continue talking some more about the pedigree of this book. This is important because earlier translations of the Bible insisted that Moses was the author, but more recent translations conspicuously refrain from mentioning Moses as author. The Bible is supposed to inspire faith and trust. But now we are faced with two differing versions that both claim to be the truth. This definitely cannot do. I'm going to try and do this talk without going into too much academic detail. After all, I want to get to the real issue, exposing the lies and deception that the biblical account is trying to sneak past our guard. I want to unveil the bigger picture that religion so dutifully tries to obscure from us. However, it is inevitable that we will have to look at some academic research, but I promise to condense it as far as possible and basically just provide you with a helicopter view, in a manner of speaking. Today I'm going to look at, firstly, why it could not have been Moses who wrote the book of Genesis. And secondly, where the book of Genesis actually comes from. Now, for starters, we need to understand that Moses was not alive when the events of creation, according to Genesis, occurred. Moses was born at a time when the Israelites supposedly were enslaved and oppressed in Egypt. There is no objective and independent source that can verify whether the biblical character of Moses actually lived, just as there is no archaeological or historical evidence of the Exodus ever happening. However, historians estimate this character's lifetime somewhere between 1600 and 1400 BCE. My guess is that they might have done this based on circumstantial details noted in the Bible that could potentially dovetail with actual historic events that were independently recorded. If it is true that Moses lived somewhere around 1500 BCE, we're sitting with a glaring problem. There's a gap of around 2,700 years between the events of creation in Genesis 1 and Moses' lifetime. In other words, by the time Moses showed up on the scene, the events of creation lay 2,700 years back in history. Where do I get this time span from? From the Bible itself. The Bible actually makes it really easy to calculate this period of time. You only need to read Genesis and Exodus and document the ages by which each Old Testament patriarch had his firstborn son. Add all these ages together and you have the period of time from Adam to Moses. For example, Adam supposedly was 130 years old when his son Seth was born. I know. How can anybody reach the age of 130 years in the absence of any advanced medical care, let alone impregnate a woman? Even in our modern era of advanced medical science, we know that this is impossible. There is absolutely no way that it could possibly have been any better in biblical times. In my mind, this is therefore simply a bold-faced lie, and I reject it as such. This is just one more of those things that render the Genesis account completely ridiculous. But for the sake of argument, let's continue with the example. Seth was 105 years old when his son Enos was born. Enos was 90 years old when his son Canaan was born. So now we already have a time span of 130 years plus 105 years plus 90 years, a total of 325 years over 3 generations. And this is the pattern that the Bible continues building on in Genesis and Exodus. So if you follow this pattern and do the calculations, you'll find that there is a generational gap of approximately 2,700 years between Adam and Moses. How could Moses possibly have recorded the book of Genesis as though he was there? Well, of course, it is possible that these events were relayed from generation to generation by word of mouth, right up to Moses' time. But folks, you probably know all too well how fraught with inaccuracy word of mouth transference of information is. Can you imagine what sorts of twists and turns, embellishment and deletion a single narrative can undergo in a period of 2,700 years? I do not have the slightest doubt that the end product after 2,700 years will be something radically different from the original narrative. In fact, I think hardly anything will be left of the original narrative. It is simply inevitable. Besides, if Moses received the Genesis report by word of mouth, then the obvious implication is that there was someone highly favored in Moses' ancestry who was entrusted with the original story, but apparently not favored enough to be identified in the Bible. One might be tempted to ask why that person did not document the story. No. Word of mouth transference to Moses seems unlikely. Besides, if by some chance it did happen that Moses penned the book of Genesis based on word of mouth transference of the creation story, then I can tell you now with total conviction that it would have been impossible for him to document any part of the narrative as factual truth. Unfortunately, that's the downside of word of mouth transference, especially over prolonged periods of time. It's as plain as that. But hang on, we're dealing with a God story here. It could be possible that God dictated the Genesis account directly to Moses to document. Not so? Yes, I guess it could be possible, but let's just consider the likelihood of this possibility for a moment. What would make Moses so special that God would wait 2,700 years to give the story to him specifically? The truth? Nothing at all. Let's accept for the moment that the history of the Old Testament patriarchs, as documented in Genesis, is the truth. The Old Testament patriarchs preceded Moses by hundreds and perhaps even thousands of years. Their history tells us of at least 5 individuals who each had a very unique and close relationship with God, who were highly influential in their communities, and who were even more eligible than Moses to be entrusted with the story of creation. Of course, I'm referring here to Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. None of them was entrusted with the story of creation. Why? If there was one person in the entire history of the universe who was truly deserving of being entrusted with the story of creation, it was Adam. After all, he supposedly received the breath of life directly from God's mouth. He was in God's company from the very beginning. I'm sure he was terribly curious about knowing how God made everything happen. I cannot think of any reason why God would have refused him the kind of information that would only 2,700 years later on be revealed to a less deserving individual. But what about this? Why would it have been necessary for someone like Moses to tell the story of Noah and the great flood, when Noah himself was much better positioned to relay the story from an eyewitness perspective? No, sorry. My common sense is telling me that Moses is an extremely unlikely candidate for authorship of Genesis. As if this is not already enough, we also have some insight from an academic research perspective. The research strongly indicates that the book of Genesis is a compilation of stories written by different authors somewhere between 600 and 400 BCE. One of the first hints pointing to multiple authorship is the fact that the book of Genesis very conspicuously revolves around two distinct main themes. Firstly, there is primeval history, which covers the stories of creation, the Great Flood, and the confusion of languages. And secondly, there is patriarchal history, which covers the stories of the first patriarchs, namely Abram, Jacob, and Joseph. These themes are very distinct from one another in terms of the topics they cover and the style of narrative in which they are recorded. Primeval history presents events and a storyline that borders on the bizarre. Even worse, the matter-of-fact reporting style makes it appear as though it was completely ordinary to see living creatures pop into existence out of thin blue air, for humans to have sexual adventures with the sons of God, and for a rainstorm to cover the entire planet under meters of water. I think one might be excused for thinking that the reporter was rather shameless in the assumption that every reader would happily gobble up whatever was reported. The patriarchal history, on the other hand, covers events that are much more realistic and relatable. It is pretty evident that different authors were involved in these two very different themes. So where does Genesis come from, if not from Moses? Well, consider for a moment that during the time of their Babylonian exile, the Israelites did not yet have a canonized book of scriptures. Very importantly, we're talking now about a period of time dating back 600 to 500 BCE. Even at this late stage of their history, thousands of years following the creation events of Genesis, they did not yet have a set of scriptures that was generally accepted as their official, complete God book. Instead, they had regional sagas, stories of their histories, their wanderings, their heroes, and their gods. Much of this was based on thousands of years' worth of retold stories and literary license taken by scribes who documented and redocumented these stories. Some of these included mythological elements. And these sagas were not even consistent with one another regarding the heroes and the gods. Different regions had different heroes and gods. Most astonishingly, over many years, these sagas were adapted and added onto, often to glorify the regimes of local kings. And there were even attempts to reconcile and combine them. One can only try to imagine what sort of literary license the scribes and historians took to massage the narratives to suit the occasion or purpose. Amongst these various documents was also the scroll of the law, which Moses supposedly received from God. So during the time of their exile in Babylon, scribes were frantically poring over these documents in search of some clue explaining the disaster of their exile. In this process, they deemed it prudent to revise some of these narratives and to add some further documents for good measure, some genealogies, laws, and ritual texts. By the end of their deportation, around 539 BCE, a small group of exiles started back to Jerusalem, carrying with them 9 scrolls that traced their history, and these included Genesis. So to answer the question where Genesis came from, it came from every Tom, Dick and Harry in the ancient Middle East up to the end of the Babylonian exile. I know I sound facetious, and I'm being facetious, but really just think for a moment through how many mouths and ears these ancient sagas must have passed before somebody thought it a good idea to start and write some of this stuff down. And several people wrote and rewrote these reports. And some reports survived and some not. This places completion of the first book of the Bible more or less 500 years before the birth of Christ. This fact alone can hardly do the book of Genesis any favors. The book, which purports to be the final authority on creation and the origins of life, turns out to be one of the more recent books of the Old Testament. And not only that, this book is the product of thousands of years of embellishment and bastardizing. Just circling back to Moses and his alleged authorship of the book of Genesis. What does it mean that Moses did not write Genesis? Well, very simply put, it means that the Bible is incorrect, where it says that Genesis is the first book of Moses. Folks, I'm done with this talk, but I'm far from done with the book of Genesis. There are still plenty of lies and inconsistencies waiting to be exposed. Join me next time when I talk a bit about the wonder of creation. This is Andre Bester for This Is What We Were Told. If you're interested in a copy of my book, mail me at the address on the screen and I'll be in touch. Have a lovely day.